So this first chapter is the culturally competent counselor, and this is basically just an introductory chapter for the rest of the textbook, and it talks about general things to consider when counseling with multicultural populations. So first we see these historical shifts over time. So originally counseling was geared more towards white, middle, upper class individuals. So if you think of the first talk therapist, this was Freud with psychoanalysis. Although I'm pretty sure that he died pretty poor. He didn't make a lot of money. Individuals who were going to him for therapy were typically more of your upper middle class individuals because they were the only ones that could afford to go with psychoanalysis, true psychoanalysis. This is long term, 20 years, sometimes 7 days a week for hours. And the only people who could really afford to take that much time were people who had money and didn't have to work. So you tended to see that counseling was geared more towards them. Another interesting thing is actually Freud did most of his research on females, not males. So think of like hysteria, that kind of thing. But that was the beginning. So then we have the first three forces. So this is psychodynamic, behaviorism, and existentialism/humanism. Important to note that there is a difference between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. So the only psychoanalytic theorist is Freud, and he was the first of his kind. He invented talk therapy. So even though people, make fun of him a lot and say he had very strange thoughts, like I said, he was the first one. He was groundbreaking. And he had a lot of people who followed him, but eventually they broke off because this is the beginning, and they wanted to start their own theories. So that would be your psychodynamic theorists. So those who broke off from psychoanalysis, this would be like Adler, Jung, Klein, Erickson, that kind of thing. So those are your psychodynamic theorists. So there's a difference. Most people these days, it's not something that's interchangeable. They are different. Most people adhere to psychodynamic theory. Although you still have psychoanalysts, and those individuals have to go to pretty extensive schooling. It's like in New York. They have to go through psychoanalysis themselves and be trained in psychoanalytic theory. So you don't usually see that these days. And then, like I said, behaviorisms, that would be like your Skinner, Watson and Rayner, that kind of thing. And then existentialism, humanism, so Carl Rogers, Maslow. With increasing diversity in the United States, we've seen a shift. So that was already a shift moving from first, second to third forces, and now you have fourth and fifth. So the fourth force would be multiculturalism, and the fifth, social advocacy. So you see a lot of research right now coming out about the fifth force, and you see it reflected a lot within academia as well. So U.S. demographics. This is from 2015, so it's not quite up to date, but it shows a pretty close estimate of what the trends are. So counseling relationship has become more complex as diversity has increased. And we see aging trends, so people are living longer. We see increased birth rates for some minority groups. We see immigration trends increasing for non-English speakers. So we see all of these things, which has led to increased diversity, and we're going to talk about each of them. So in general, our U.S. demographic makeup, we see that we have about 321.5 million individuals in the United States. And of that, we see more white individuals, about 77%, followed by Black individuals, 13%, Asian Americans at about 5%, and then other races at about 4%. Within that, about 17% of individuals identify as Hispanic or Latino, and about 13% identify as being foreign-born, with the majority of those individuals coming from Latin America. So kind of overall with our trends of immigration, we've seen that from the 1970s to 2012, European individuals went from about 62% of the individuals immigrating to about 11%. So we've seen a huge decline in those individuals. We've seen Asian individuals coming to the U.S. from 9% to 29%, so that shift. So we see this is growing. And then Latin Americans are going from 19% to 53% of the individuals who are immigrating. So Asian Americans and Hispanic Latino Americans are the fastest growing populations right now. So in the United States, we see that people are living longer. And this is going to affect our demographics as well. We also say with median household income, about 15.8% report annual incomes below the poverty line, and that was in 2013. So this might have changed over the years, especially with things that have happened more recently. It's probably more than about 16% right now. Poverty increased between 2007 and 2011, but held stable between 2012 and 2013. And like I said, it's probably worse now. We see that females outnumber males and experience disproportionate poverty rates. So in particular, female heads of households with no partner or husband make up about 32.5% of poor families, with a median household income of about $35,154. And it's important to keep in mind that the majority of families that have female heads of households with no partners have children that are under the age of 18. So that's something that might come up with your counseling clients. The highest median household income in 2013 was Asian Americans with about $67,000 per year, followed by white non-Hispanics with about $58,000, followed by Hispanic Latinos with about $40,000, and then Black and African Americans with about $34,000. So we see that disparity. So what is multicultural counseling? The definition from your textbook is that multicultural counseling is counseling that integrates cultural identities and takes into account their influence on the counseling relationship, process, and outcome. So culture would be the shared values, practices, social norms, and worldviews associated with a particular cultural group. And within that, we have subgroups. So this would be like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, disability, spirituality, age, etc. And these subgroups are what we're going to spend the majority of the class talking about. So we'll break down different subgroups with each chapter. So overall, it's really important to keep in mind that every individual, so this would be counselor and client alike, has a unique combination of cultural group membership, and this brings different social, political, biological, and historical experiences into the counseling process. So that is why this class is important, because no matter who you are, everyone you meet, unless they're your biological identical twin that you've gone through every single experience exactly the same, although that would be next to impossible, everyone's going to have different experiences than you. So they'll have different subgroups than you. You may experience seeing lots of clients who have very similar subgroups to you, but there's still going to be different ones. So it's very important to keep that in mind with each relationship you go into. I've had audiology students in the past, so this isn't just for counselors, it's for anyone, any profession. Every single patient that you have will be different than yourself, and that's something to keep in mind. You also have the role of the U.S. or American culture to keep in mind as well. It's something that's forgotten a lot. So American culture and American value may not always be congruent with the values that we hold regarding various cultural identities. So there might be a bit of a clash there, and that might come up within your counseling relationship. So keep that in mind. Okay. So research shows that culturally diverse clients tend to underuse and prematurely terminate counseling services. And this can be factored out into attitudinal reasons and structural reasons. So attitudinal factors would be beliefs about the counselor personally and professionally and about the counseling process. So this could be like stigma, cultural mistrust, any discrimination experiences that that client has had in the past. All of those things are going to affect their attitude towards counseling and services. And then we also have structural factors. So these would be systemic barriers that determine the availability of counseling to an individual. These could be barriers associated with geography, so where the individual lives. I've had clients who didn't have a counselor anywhere near where they lived. They lived in a tiny town, 45 minutes away from the clinic. I've had clients who couldn't actually get out off of their property. Like say it's raining, something like that. They can't see their counselor because their road is flooded. Socioeconomic status is another one, so not being able to afford seeing a counselor. Language barriers, so not being able to find a counselor that speaks your language. Research shows that it's best to talk in your native tongue when you're talking about emotions, that kind of thing. And then the general knowledge base related to culture and mental health. So a lot of people just don't know about counseling. They don't know what it can do for them, the type of services that are out there, where to find those services, how to get to those services, how to get a ride. There's all kinds of things that might go into structural factors. So counseling values may not be congruent with individual culture. So counseling values mirror the dominant U.S. culture values of individualism and autonomy, a preference for increased self-awareness, self-disclosure, and emotional expression, and an emphasis on a linear time orientation and goal-directedness. So, for instance, collectivism and interdependence and limited disclosure out of respect for the family and community members, that's going to clash with that those American cultural values, which are reflected within most counseling values. Culturally diverse clients may perceive counseling to be stigmatizing. We've seen this shifting over the years. We see less and less stigma, but it still is experienced by a lot of individuals. Traditional counseling theories tend to minimize a systems approach, often pathologizing close connections among family members through terms such as enmeshment and codependency. So that's something else that might come up as well. This might be completely normal in one culture to be very close, to have multiple generations living in a household, to maybe bring family members to counseling. And that might be seen as abnormal for some counselors who are adhering more to American values, and as a result, overarching counseling values. So that's something to keep in mind when you're being a culturally competent counselor or provider. So stigma and mistrust. Some cultures view mental illness as something to be discussed only within a specific community. So they might rely on family, community, and spiritual leaders. That might be the first people that they go to. And they might not even think about seeing a counselor, or after going to family and community and spiritual leaders, a therapist might be an afterthought, and typically by that point, things have gotten pretty out of hand. The way normality and abnormality are defined in counseling, that's something to keep in mind. So just like what I said a few seconds ago, some cultures may view having multiple generations around as completely normal, and some might view that as abnormal, enmeshment, this is unhealthy, that kind of thing. So the way we view normality and abnormality, it's very fluid, and there's no one way of looking at it, if that makes sense. Some cultures may view hallucinations to an extent to be normal, so talking with ancestors, that kind of thing, while others view that as completely abnormal. And this is something that you need to keep in mind when you're working with a client. Do your research, talk with them, find out what is normal and abnormal within their community, within their culture, and that can help you work with them on more of a one-to-one basis rather than having preconceived notions and assumptions and generalizations. So keep that in mind. Something I bring up in classes a lot when I'm talking about normality versus abnormality is normality a universal and consistent construct across social and cultural, historical, and political context, or is it not universal? And the example that I like to bring up is this idea of symptom pools. So I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of this idea, but when you live in a culture, you have this, you can think of it as a pool of acceptable symptoms to demonstrate when you're going through mental health issues. So depression in the United States, we tend to see that through crying, isolation, maybe decreased appetite, that kind of stuff. But when you look at like Asian American cultures or Asian cultures, you tend to see depression showing up more somatically. So stomach ache, headache, that's more within their symptom pool. Those are acceptable symptoms. So An example is in Fiji. In Fiji, they did not have eating disorders. Anorexia did not exist until the Western television was brought to their culture. So when they were exposed to Western TV, models, skinny actors, actresses, that is when you started to see eating disorders show up, because it entered into their symptom pool and it wasn't there before. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about normality versus abnormality, and is it universal or is it not? And if you're really interested in that, you can read this book called Crazy Like Us: The Globalization of the American Psyche. It's a pretty interesting book, and that's where I got that example of Fiji from. So prejudice and inappropriate applications of cultural issues may lead to misdiagnosis, so that's something else to keep in mind. I see that a lot. The main thing that I do is assessment, and mainly with adolescents. So I see inappropriate diagnoses all the time, especially with like ADHD, that kind of thing. And then evidence that counselors may underdiagnose, overdiagnose, or misdiagnose culturally diverse client problems. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 18. Okay. So inaccessibility of services, we kind of touched on this. So we have geographic barriers. And that could be this tend toward a lack of mental health services in communities where people of color and lower SES groups reside. So counseling is often unavailable for non-English speaking clients as well. So I've been to a few sites where they've had like the phone lines for different languages. And if that's all you have, that's all you have. But generally, like I said, you want to be able to talk with your client in their native tongue. And when it comes to counseling, you really don't want any external factors influencing it. And you want to keep confidentiality as much as possible. So you have a lot of ethical issues that could come up with using phone lines and interpreters, that kind of thing. Another thing to think about when you have a client who speaks a different language is a lot of times they end up bringing in a family member. A lot of times this ends up being a child, but it could be a sibling or an aunt, uncle, someone else in the family. And that comes with its own issues, ethically and within the counseling relationship, especially if it's a child. You know, how is that affecting the parent-child relationship? What is bringing the client into counseling? You know, all of these things are things that you have to keep in mind and kind of work through and talk with your clients about. Other barriers would be economic. So additional economic barriers arise for individuals from lower SES. Traditional counseling may be cost prohibitive for certain diverse groups. Time off of work, unemployment, homelessness, transportation, childcare, rural living, disabilities, all of these things come up when it comes to counseling. So I've had clients, I've worked a lot with rural individuals who, like I said, they couldn't get out of their house to make it to the counseling session because of a storm. I had a client who each week showed up over an hour early. I mean, I would get there about an hour early because I had a client before them. So I know at least an hour, but come to find out some days it was hours before session. And I always thought, oh, they're just early, that kind of thing. But one day I talked with them about it, and it turned out it was because they had to be driven up there. And that was the only time that the driver could come by on their route to bring them. And then they usually had to sit there for a while after therapy. And that's important to think about and talk about in session as well, because that showed me, wow, you really think that therapy is very important. And you being that invested means that you're going to do that much better in therapy. You're going to get even more out of it. And then another thing to consider is that approximately 75% of those with mental health related disabilities are unemployed, and about 15% with common psychotic and mood disorders identify as homeless. So in other words, the people who may need the help the most a lot of times can't receive services because of barriers. So these are things to keep in mind. Okay, so verbal communication. So most counseling theories rely on spoken words as a primary tool for promoting growth and change. So like Freud with psychoanalysis, this was called the talking cure. Most counseling, when we think about it, has to do with talking. You have play therapy, which doesn't really involve much talking, art therapy, that kind of thing, but talking is very important for psychotherapy. And many people still actually refer to counseling as talk therapy. In the context of multicultural counseling, differences in language and styles of communication can create a significant barrier to establishing a therapeutic relationship and working towards change. So, this is something to keep in mind, and it's not just when English isn't a first language for a client. It can also have to do with the culture that the client grew up in, what language means within the culture, things like that. So, more than 60.6 million people in the United States speak a language other than English at home. And metaphors are rich in cultural meaning and may be related to religious teachings or cultural values. So, something that you could do within the counseling relationship if you have a client with a different culture than your own is bringing in metaphors from their culture, kind of meeting them where they're at, so you can help them to understand maybe a concept you're trying to convey within the therapy session. So bringing in metaphors can be really helpful. Often culture-specific phrases or subtle nuances of words in one's native language are best able to articulate emotions. So that's getting at what I talked about earlier with research showing that the client talking in their first language, that's the best way to go about therapy, because you're able to convey emotions, I suppose you could say, in their most raw form, because it's more natural, it's within your first language. So that's the best way to go about it. And like I said, that could be an issue with interpreters. You want to look into the ethics there and talk with your client and make sure they feel comfortable, and maybe talk with colleagues, that kind of thing. So let's see. Nonverbal communication, as we know, is extremely important. So 85% of communication is actually nonverbal, and this ranges from facial expressions, proxemics, so the use of personal distance, physical distance, kinesics, so that would be like body movements, positions, postures, that kind of thing, and then paralanguage, so verbal cues, other than words. So these things, yeah, I'm sure you're all talking about quite a bit in your counseling classes, techniques, that kind of thing. And I would say that this may be more important for some of you than others, depending on the theory that you adhere to, like interpersonal process theory, that kind of thing. You might use more reliance on nonverbal communication, the here and now. But overall, nonverbal communication is extremely important, especially in therapy and picking up on that, but also being really aware of your own nonverbal communication. So I'm sure you've talked about like crossing your arms, that's a barrier between you and your client, crossing your legs, the way you face the client if you're turned away, wanting to have an open stance, a somewhat neutral look on your face, but not too negative, not too positive, being careful with your nodding, not wanting to say that something that they're saying is okay by nodding to it too much. All of those things you'll talk about in your techniques class, but keeping that in mind from a multicultural perspective. So often ambiguous and culturally bound, nonverbal communication can be. So this is like eye contact, personal distance. So same nonverbal expressions can have substantially different meanings depending on what culture you're dealing with. So some examples from the textbook. At an arm's length. So for European Americans, that's a very comfortable distance. But an arm's length might be viewed as cold or unfriendly for an Arab individual, because very close physical proximity is considered comfortable as an interpersonal distance. So kind of keeping that in mind. If your client is starting to seem uncomfortable and you're seeing an Arab client, you might want to consider that your physical distance could be part of the reason for them being uncomfortable, and you may want to discuss it. Traditional Western cultures, typically lack of direct eye contact is indicating shame or depression, guilt, that kind of thing. But some Eastern cultures, a lack of direct eye contact actually indicates respect. So that's almost the opposite. So keeping that in mind, and I will repeat this over and over and over again with every single chapter. We can't generalize all of this stuff, but having this information to keep in the back of our mind is important because, that might be what's going on, the issue. So nonverbal communication often operates outside of conscious awareness, and it's difficult to falsify, therefore making it key to understanding a client's genuine experience. And like I said, that would be really important if you were adhered to interpersonal psychotherapy. Emotional expressions, so universal emotions. The textbook discussed anger, sadness, gladness, fright, surprise, and disgust. But if you are really interested in the idea of emotions, I would actually look into Paul Ekman. So he is the researcher who researched emotions, and he actually labeled 7 and kind of proved, I suppose you could say, that emotions are universal. So regardless of the culture you're looking at, everyone experiences these same 7 main emotions. So they're anger, disgust, enjoyment, fear, sadness, surprise, and more recently he added contempt. So those are the 7 main emotions, which are fairly similar to the emotions discussed in the textbook, but he's the main researcher there. So emotions are usually considered either reactions to external events or the result of a chemical process in the brain. Socialization influences the way emotions are experienced and expressed. In dominant culture, the expression of emotions is typically viewed as a component of mental health. Non-Western cultures, emotions may be experienced somatically, so I talked about that earlier. You see that a lot with Asian cultures, experiencing like a stomach ache or a headache as a symptom, and viewed as a component of physical health, since the verbal expression of strong emotions may be considered culturally unacceptable. So that's something to consider with your clients. If you have a client that's constantly complaining of a stomach ache, don't jump to, maybe they have a physical issue and they need to see a medical doctor, although you would want to suggest that just in case, but that might be the symptom that they're using for their depression. And that if they keep talking about it, that might be actually what they're getting at, is they're feeling depression. Socialization, so European American culture, females tend to be socialized to be more outwardly emotionally expressive than males. So that's something that might come up with the counseling relationship. And then in Asian and Latino cultures, individuals may be guarded in their display of emotions because of social stigma associated with mental health issues. So things to keep in mind. Communication patterns. So ideally, communication patterns between counselor and client are characterized by openness and honesty. So that's something you'll talk about in techniques as well. Wanting to have a very validating and non-judgmental environment so that the client feels comfortable enough to be vulnerable with you. That's very important. So the counselor, your textbook says, should basically be proactive. So consistently check in with the client to make sure that you're accurately interpreting and understanding them, engage in self-reflective process yourself, respond based on the client's frame of reference, and self-disclose appropriately to promote trust. So when it comes to this, I like to make sure that people know, counselors know, if you feel like you missed something, you didn't address something in session like this, like you didn't check in with your client to make sure you understood them right, if it's important, the client is going to bring it up again, probably again and again and again. So you'll be able to address it. It's not like it's never going to come up again. And also, it's important to discuss a lot of this stuff at the beginning of your relationship with your client. So when you're doing your informed consent, I usually like to have a conversation with my client about the fact that we have different experiences and backgrounds and subgroups, and therefore I might not interpret what they're saying correctly at times. And I want to make sure that my client feels comfortable with me, that they can tell me that. So I'm kind of giving them the okay to do that. And I tell them I'm going to check in with you throughout session just to make sure that I am understanding you. And you'll see it as well, especially depending on your theoretical orientation, but maybe with their nonverbal body language, something like that, that, you said something and they seemed off. So maybe that's because you misinterpreted what they said. And to be honest, most of the time, the client will tell you if you misinterpret them, and it's really not a big deal. You just kind of keep going with it. But that will happen. Self-reflective processes to evaluate how the counselor inadvertently communicates personal biases, values, and assumptions to a client. So, for example, aspects of the client's story a counselor chooses to respond to, and that's going to indicate what the counselor considers important. So that will come up as well. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of interactions with people, right? And within a 1 hour session, there will be so many things that occur with the body language and verbal communication and all of this. And yet we only tune into certain aspects of it, right? So we selectively, although unconsciously, pay attention to different aspects of the session. So you could leave session kind of remembering different things than your client does, and that's important to think of as well, because your background is going to influence what you pick up on as important with your client. So keeping that in mind, to make sure you don't fall into any of those traps. Okay, so prejudice and discrimination. So the definition of prejudice from your textbook is prematurely holding a belief or attitude without appropriate examination or consideration of the actual data. So this could be positive or negative, but it's a belief or an attitude. So keep that in mind. So prejudice may be either positive or negative and is based on stereotyped views and accompanying emotions. So an example from I think this is from the textbook maybe, is to prejudge Asian Americans to be high achievers or females to be too emotional. Discrimination is covert and overt behaviors based on generalizations held about individuals based on their cultural group membership. So that's the difference there. Prejudice is your beliefs and attitudes. Discrimination is actual behaviors. So an example of discrimination would be hiring or firing someone on the basis of his or her sexual orientation. So doing that behavior. So both prejudice and discrimination are based on stereotypes, include racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism. They impart economic, social, political, mental, and physical costs. And something that this kind of made me think of was like the allostatic load. So Bruce McEwen and Steller, if you're interested in that research, they research chronic stress. So if you're experiencing prejudice or discrimination, real or perceived, you're going to experience a great deal of chronic stress, and cortisol is just corrosive, right? So they came up with the allostatic load, so that would be the amount of chronic stress that you're carrying at all times, and then the weathering hypothesis. So this cortisol being corrosive eventually kind of weathers down your brain and causes a lot of issues. So you have a physical reaction to that chronic stress, and it can be it could change, or it can end your life early. So it's very, very bad. Encouraging maladaptive coping responses, so experiencing prejudice and discrimination, your client may end up coping with that in a negative or maladaptive way. So you can think of like substance use, that kind of thing. It can serve as a catalyst for depression, suicide, substance use, violence, anxiety disorders, and stress, and it can fuel medical complications like hypertension, heart disease, and cancer. So really, the stress associated with experiencing prejudice and discrimination is what causes all of these things. Something else to think about is immigration. So the definition from the textbook is that this is the process by which foreign-born individuals settle in a new country. So most racial ethnic groups are immigrants or were immigrants at some point, with the exception of Native Americans and Native Hawaiians. Examining the reasons for entry to the United States, the length of time the individual has been in the United States, information about the cultural climate of the country of origin, and the historical and present degrees of prejudice and discrimination faced by the client's family are all very important and something that you may want to discuss with your client in session. Immigration can be either voluntary or involuntary, so that's another important thing to discuss. That could be one of the reasons why your client is seeking counseling. And that's another thing to keep in mind. A lot of times, the presenting problem the client brings you is not really the presenting problem, if that makes sense. So it happens all the time. They'll come in, they'll say it's X, and then once you start talking with them, their problem really ends up being Y, or a mixture of X, Y, and Z. So one of the issues that could come up if you have a client who immigrated is it could be their reasoning for immigrating, or their feelings towards that change. So something to keep in mind. Many individuals choose to enter the United States to flee political or religious persecution or to improve their economic conditions. And voluntary or involuntary immigration, individuals are often separated from their family and their homeland, and this creates several mental health considerations. So something else to keep in mind with your clients who have immigrated is acculturation. So this is the degree to which immigrants identify with and conform to the new culture of a host society. So for us, it would be the United States. Or the degree to which they integrate new cultural values into their current value system. So you can identify with both your homeland and your host culture, and embracing one culture over another, or you can reject both cultures. So there are actually 4 models of acculturation. There's the assimilation model. So here, the individual is highly acculturated. They identify solely with the new culture or the more dominant group. So this would be an individual who's immigrated to the United States, and they've completely stopped all of their prior cultural norms, and they're taken in the United States 100%. They're an American. The separation model, these individuals refuse to adapt to cultural values outside of their own. So they bring their own cultural values to the United States, and that's it. They are not American at all. The integration model refers to biculturalism. So this is a process in which individuals identify with both their own culture and the host culture. So they have a mix of both. And then the marginalization model. So here, individuals reject cultural values and customs of both cultures. So your clients who have immigrated are going to fall somewhere within these 4 models. So this is largely determined by the number of years that the individual has been in the new country, the host country. It's determined by their country of origin, their age of onset of the acculturation process, and their ethnic identity. So the longer a client has been in the United States, the younger they were when they entered the United States, the easier acculturation process is going to be for them. It originates from the country, if they originate from a country similar to the United States, so if it's an English-speaking country, if it's a country with shared customs and values, then the transition is going to be easier as well. And then the stressors of giving up, limiting, or denying cultural values and customs can lead to depression, anxiety, isolation, substance use, physical health concerns, and identity confusion. So that's something to keep in mind with your clients as well. Interpersonal violence and trauma. So interpersonal violence and trauma are stressors that apply across cultural identities, including race and ethnicity, gender, SES, and sexual orientation. So some immigrants that were refugees and fled countries were involved in war, killings, starvation, and sexual trauma. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And this is linked to PTSD, other health problems like depression, and many people in lower SES neighborhoods have a disproportionate number of racial or ethnic minorities and women as heads of households, and they're more likely to experience those high levels of unemployment, crime, and violence, and as a result, violence and trauma. So you're going to see that more. It often occurs in, like I said, lower SES communities among women. It's also among gay, lesbians, and bisexual individuals. So you're going to see more violence and trauma there as well. We'll talk about that more when we talk about those subgroups. So developing multicultural counseling competence. So we have the multicultural counseling competency standards and guidelines, and you can find that article if that's something you're interested in looking into a bit more. So 4 developmental domains to consider. We have counselor self-awareness, counseling relationship, client worldview, and counseling and advocacy intervention. So this is a set of guidelines that calls attention to the awareness, knowledge, skills, and counseling and advocacy interventions required to counsel in a multiculturally competent manner. So the counseling relationship occurs within context of varying degrees of privilege and oppression, and we see the model here. You can kind of see that. And something that's really important to keep in mind with your counseling relationships is no matter what, there's going to be a power and authority differential between you and your client, with the counselor having more power and authority because they are seen as the expert. And depending on your theoretical orientation, you may go above and beyond to try to break down this differential. So for instance, if you are adhere to feminist theory, one of the big components of that is having no power differential between you and your client, although you could argue that that's kind of impossible, but to try to limit it as much as possible. So that's something to keep in mind as well. A systems approach. So we cannot become multiculturally competent without considering the influence of family, community, and other environmental factors on our clients and our own lives. So that can be broken down into individual, family, friends, and peers, community, and historical. We'll talk about each of those. So for individual, we have race, ethnicity, gender, SES, spirituality, disability, sexual orientation, acculturation, racial identity development, spiritual identity development. All of these things are at the individual level. Individual, this would be level 1. So understanding your own cultural group membership, so all of the ones I listed. So that's important for your client and for you as a counselor. The next level is levels 2, 3, and 4. So that's family, friends, and peers. We have understanding how family, friends, and peers as a system affect your client's worldviews and behaviors. So this plays a significant role in your client's cultural identity, understanding like the dynamics there. And you might also have violence and trauma within families that you need to consider. So community is going to be your level 5. So achieving this aim may involve connecting clients and their immediate supports to available resources, working to change community practices, and increasing community awareness and resources to better serve culturally diverse clientele. So this is your social advocacy piece within the systems approach. So counselors are encouraged to increase their knowledge to connect clients and their immediate supports to available resources in the community. So something that I did in my master's program, it might have been in techniques class, I'm not sure. One of my counseling classes was I had to go for a project around the city and make a binder with resources for different issues. So for substance use, maybe AA meetings, NA meetings, different counselors in town that I could refer my clients to for specific problems, inpatient facilities, the list goes on. So having all of those resources is extremely important. Food banks, all of that. So I suggest that you guys do that wherever you plan on settling down roots. Build yourself a nice reference book, which most places you work at, they have one that you can kind of work with and maybe add to. And then level 6 is historical. So historical experiences of oppression can create problems for many culturally diverse clients within a community, affecting their access to resources, their sense of belonging, and thus their mental health. So this is something to keep in mind as well. And then ethical considerations. So counselors have an obligation to engage in multiculturally competent counseling. I view this as a foundational piece to all therapy. It's within our ACA Code of Ethics and the APA Code of Ethics. So for ACA Code of Ethics, it's listed in Table 1.4. And then your textbook talked about a few court cases that I think are pretty important because it has to do with counseling students. So we have Keaton versus Anderson Wiley in 2011. So Jennifer Keaton was a practicum school counseling student at Augusta State University in Georgia. And she just mentioned to teachers and peers that she viewed homosexuality as immoral and intended to express this view to any future LGBTQ clients that she might be working with. And she also said that she planned to convert them to heterosexuality. So the faculty caught wind of this, and they ordered her to complete a remediation plan prior to entering practicum. She did not comply, and so she was expelled from the program. And then she sued the school based on the First Amendment speech and religious rights. So she did lose that case on the grounds that the program was not denying these rights, but was requiring the student to counsel LGBTQ clients effectively. So this is that idea that we help all clients, regardless of background. That's our job, is to help people. The next case was the Ward versus Polite in 2012. So for this one, Julia Ward was a practicum school counseling student again, and she was at Eastern Michigan University. She was assigned a client that was dealing with depression symptoms and issues related to a same-sex relationship. So Julia Ward was religious and didn't feel comfortable working with this LGBTQ client, so she asked her supervisor if she could refer the client. And this is against our ethics standard. Counselors cannot discriminate, so we can't use referring clients as a loophole to get around working with a client that maybe we don't agree with, which is what a lot of counselors were doing in the past. So this is actually addressed in our ethics code, and that's what she was trying to do. So Ward was dismissed from her program. She sued, and the judge upheld the university's decision to dismiss her. And then the last one is Ward versus Wilbanks. So this is the same one, Julia Ward, in 2000. Well, I guess this one would be in 2012. So she appealed the decision, and the higher court overturned the previous court decision, and then they settled out of court. So those are some court cases that adhere to multicultural counseling students. So something that's important to know. And that is it for Chapter 1.